Licensed games are nothing new to this channel, and have been around as long as computer and video games have. But in the mid-1980s, an anime franchise that got its start as a photo book would have very interesting ties to computer history. From being part of a marketing push of a very specific computer standard in Japan, for a company that would become much more involved in gaming decades later, to a top-down space shooting game that would involve one of Nintendo's longest-serving and most faithful studios, and an adventure game that would bring together talent from practically every computer software company at the time, and predate a similar arrangement for console game development. The expectations for this surprisingly fatalistic science fiction series were very high. But the dual misfortunes of setting expectations too high, and years of delays leading to several planned titles never coming to market, would cause this venture to collapse under its own ambitions. And the story of the system these games were initially developed for, and whose history they are quite intrinsically tied to, would also be one of great ambition, famous partnerships, and weaving a legend. This is the story of the Gall Force series, how it tied to Japanese computing, and how it all started with the initial design of the MSX. While the myth-making of the creation of the MSX tends to state that it's the combined brainchild of Bill Gates and Kazuhiko Nishi, the truth is a little bit more complex, as the Standard would come out of the efforts of many individuals from different companies. It all starts with Nishi, who, while already a student at Waseda University in Shinjuku in 1977, started a small magazine that would become a publishing empire called ASCII. ASCII would have many business ventures, but they would be most familiar to viewers of the channel as the company behind Login Magazine, one of our primary sources for much of our information. ASCII would eventually grow to have their hands in practically every aspect of personal computing. But one of the earliest things Nishi did a year after, in 1978, was to secure with the newly formed Microsoft the rights to import their software, leading to the formation of ASCII Microsoft Limited, also known in contemporary American press as Microsoft Far East. 5 years later, as Microsoft versions of BASIC and Tim Patterson's operating system MS-DOS began to gain traction in the market, businessmen Alex Weiss and Garry Fox decided to set up a computer company. According to an article in What MSX Magazine, while the corporation was based in New York, they were actually physically based in Hong Kong. This company would be called Spectravision, later renamed to Spectra Video due to a conflict with another company with the same name. And due to their location on the other side of the globe, when negotiating the usage of Microsoft's version of BASIC for their upcoming machine, their primary contact would be Kazuhiko Nishi. Their plans would put them on Nishi's radar, and when their SVI computer began to take elements of other versions of BASIC, and began to work with larger memory options than their contemporaries, the appeal was so great that it would cement Nishi's interest in it. As a dream of Nishi's, the primary purpose of the MSX Standard was to introduce hardware that would be compatible across multiple models so that software and hardware could be specifically tailored and swapped between machines. Nishi would eventually take the not yet released SVI computers and use that as a basis to modify the design into what would become the MSX Standard, all while modifying the hardware, eventually to a point where it could be considered a separate system from what SVI had designed. Another purpose of the MSX, at least according to Nishi in recent interviews, was to compete in environments where Microsoft Far East believed their architecture could become number one in the market. Nishi believed that the varying computer models of Japan, and the dominance of the Spectrum, in Europe and the UK especially, would open up the opportunity to compete and dominate there, as opposed to the United States, where IBM had a massive foothold on the computer market and a reputation for stamping out the competition. However, some of this seems to be a bit of a revisionist history. Contemporary interviews with Gates and Nishi both indicate that they were seriously considering the US market, with Gates positing that it might become the #1 computer in America due to reduced cost, and Nishi being a bit more cautious about the situation, as revealed on an interview with a California radio station. Additionally, the repurposing of SVI's machines caused their first released models to be incompatible with the MSX Standard. But that's not what SVI's marketing implied, leading to further confusion which may have impeded rollout, and turned off both Gates and Nishi to the idea of a larger US presence. At any rate, this large push of MSX machines into the USA didn't happen, with Nishi instead concentrating on securing hardware contracts for his new computer standard. And Microsoft Far East was able to secure some very heavy hitters, with computers made by Panasonic, Mitsubishi, Hitachi, and many others. But even if a manufacturer was following a hardware standard, that would not stop them from wanting to outperform their competitors. And it was one model in particular that would make a serious attempt in branding itself to be the most advanced version of the standard in its advertising: the Sony Hitbit MSX. When focusing on this particular line of machines, Sony primarily put their eyes on two things: design and advertising. The design of the Hitbit is elegant, sleek, and stands out from most of its competitors, looking a bit more sharp-angled and futuristic. And the advertising would be of a higher caliber and budget as well, to try to capitalize on that futurist image. Starting out with the usual celebrity endorsements, primarily by singer Seiko Matsuda, and a jingle that will never ever leave your brain, ever, once you hear it. They would move on to more unusual ads which partnered with celebrity designers, such as a memorable one done with Sid Mead showing vehicles made of light in a utopian future. But this wouldn't be their only partnership, and it's here where Gall Force comes into the story. Originally serialized in Model Graphics magazine, Gall Force told the story of members of an all-female warrior race called the Solnoids, who are being pursued by an alien race called the Paranoids. In its initial iteration, with characters designed by Kenichi Sonoda of Bubblegum Crisis, Gall Force's photo serial focused on 3 characters: Rabby, a sort of example of a bunny girl archetype; Hattie, your more traditional fiery redhead; and the younger Rumi, an extremely talented engineer. The serialization, which would later be collected in the omnibus edition Starfront, a paperback volume with the entire photo series, as well as other drawings and essays about the world and characters. These serials would prove popular, and the memorable nature of the models they used would cause Sony to use them for their Hitbit HBF1, particularly the character of Rabby. And since Artmic, the company behind Gall Force at this point, had already worked with Sony in designing the vehicles for the Sid Mead commercial, both sides felt that it was a good match. Over a 5-day period, the staff at Artmic made lighted dioramas of the Rabby model, this time in a giant mech for some of the shots, and prepared other tableaus for short photocomic advertisements utilized to sell the computer. This relationship would continue, with Artmic designing a mech suit for the computer box cover as part of the same campaign. However, it wouldn't be the only Gall Force media tied to the Hitbit HBF1. According to the Artmic Designs book, the first computer game released in the Gall Force franchise would be released day and date with it. And that would be the MSX version of Gall Force Defensive Chaos, a top-down shooter developed by HAL Laboratory. Famous for being the starting point of Satoru Iwata, one of its first part-time employees along with other students, and having only one registered employee at its start, Mitsuhiro Ikeda, HAL Laboratory started out after evolving out of the computer section of a department store by making Pasacon games out of a small apartment in Akihabara. In the early days, these would mostly be arcade ports and clones, such as Star Battle for the VIC-20, an Iwata-designed game. This arcade sensibility shines through in their game Gall Force Defensive Chaos, a frantic arcade shooter that both pushes the tech of the MSX and also tries to do something innovative and different with traditional STG gameplay. In Defensive Chaos, our 3 characters have been expanded out into a roster of 7, each of which with a different ship and set of upgrades that drastically changes the playstyle of anyone engaging with the game. First, we have the 3 characters from the original photo novel. Rabi starts out in a ship with more endurance that slowly gains the ability to increase its projectile output, creating the most traditional upgrade path and bullet spread of a typical shooting game of that era. But the other characters are far from typical. Next, we have Patty, whose ship gains the ability upon upgrade to fire from the sides, allowing her greater control against some of the enemy types in the game, like latticework ships that are constantly targeting the port and starboard of the player. Rounding out the original characters from the photo novel, we have Rumi, whose ship is more omnidirectional and tiny. It even starts out with a triple shot in her most basic form. This ship is excellent for crowd control and bosses. Adding to the mix, we have 4 new characters, starting with Luffy, who would occasionally act as series protagonist in future works. Her ship, the Short Brig, has traditional beam weapons, and she's kind of a giant glass cannon. Her ship is extremely powerful, but its large size can act as a detriment in intense areas. Next up, of the 4 new characters, we have Elusa, whose ship, the Wide, has many upgrades and eventually becomes a type of spread gun. Elusa is the captain of the team in other adaptations, and we'll talk about her character in detail a little later on. Rounding out the team, we have Pony, whose main feature is that she can summon more attack personnel, which can change position and become greater in number the more upgrades you pick up. I found this character good for using against swarms. Finally, we have Catty, whose ship, the Missile Shot, has upgrades of circular projectiles that can work very well against large numbers of enemies. This character is very good for flying through treacherous areas. Each character has around 20 upgrades for their ship, and being hit knocks you back an upgrade, giving you a bit more endurance than your typical STG. All in all, it's over 100 combinations of weapons, and the innovation doesn't stop there. As you progress through the game, you can find a great deal of these upgrades, but not everything is a power-up. In a nod to the many secrets of Xevious, a game whose spirit really does flow through this game, sometimes you unlock extremely well-hidden additional members of your team. This will increase until you have all 7 team members, and occasionally catching a second power-up will allow you to transfer between them, allowing you to switch to a ship that could have better control of the situation. There are also catapults that can switch you between land sections of the level and space sections, giving you a chance to look for more hidden crew members or simply rack up more points and upgrades. Make it through to the end of the level and you will face a boss, which is usually drawn with a great level of detail, but stationary, attacking you with complex bullet patterns that occasionally have a rather frustrating element of randomization. The game is quite difficult and frantic, and rewards memorization and pattern recognition, but occasionally feels a bit unfair, with some cheap deaths caused by unavoidable attacks. The graphics are pretty solid. The MSX isn't exactly built for the smooth scrolling that shooting games require, so a lot of times programmers would utilize trickery to simulate it. This game is no exception, erasing the top line of the screen while drawing in the bottom to give the illusion of vertical movement. While it's not exactly smooth, it's serviceable enough, and the game can get surprisingly frantic as the difficulty ramps up in later stages and the enemy sprites get more frequent. This frantic gameplay can also sometimes work against the game. Since there's no repeat on the trigger, it's very common to pick up the power-up that lets you switch ships, and then button press right past it from sheer muscle memory, sticking the player in an awkward situation when they want to change strategies. The plot is sparse, really only limited to a generic lore explanation in the manual and a congratulations message at the end. What music is in the game is pretty limited, with the most repeating track being a remix of a song that plays in a memorable moment in Gall Force's first anime adaptation that covers a ground-to-space battle. But before talking about that adaptation, and the games that did and did not spring from it, it's worth noting that this wasn't the only HAL Labs developed game in the Gall Force series, with the next one being a conversion of this for the Famicom Disk System titled Gall Force Eternal Story. In the FDS conversion primarily designed by Tadashi Mukai, most known as a programmer and map designer on Famicom game Air Fortress, you can see that some changes have been made in order to accommodate player experience a bit better. It's not easier. The game is still as frantic as ever, but it at least gives the player quite a bit more options in combat. Probably the biggest control change is that this time around the process of switching between characters is made much easier. Instead of hunting for a secret power-up, this time around, you can just press select, and your ship will rather beautifully morph into one of the other character's vehicles. This allows for much more on-the-fly switching. This being a Famicom title, the scrolling has improved as well, now moving quite smoothly, as waves of incoming enemies attack the player's ship. Finally, there are many more opportunities to go up into space through the slingshot, where finding other characters has now become much more straightforward. Beat the entire space level you are slingshot into, and you are rewarded with another member of the team. The music and graphics have had quite a bit of an upgrade as well, and the ship feels a lot more durable. Well, the ship feels like it doesn't have as much upgradability, and the usual long load times of the Famicom Disk System rear their ugly head again here. This honestly felt like the preferred version of the game to play to me. But this wouldn't be the only game to have the name Gall Force Eternal Story, and the Japanese personal computer game would have an initial ambition so high that it would recruit developers from all over the Pasacon world. In the interest of promoting their upcoming OVA based on their Star Force photo novel, Artmic would hire personnel from multiple Pasacon companies to create a command list adventure game taking elements from both the upcoming anime and the original photo strip. Forming a group under the name Session 61, it would include members of some teams we've covered previously on this channel. Story-focused adventure creators System Socom, Sokoban creators Thinking Rabbit, and Both Tech, the creators of Relics. New to the channel were other members of the Session 61 project. Hummingbird Soft, another adventure-focused developer that was at that point mainly responsible for titles like the memorable Abyss series of adventure games, and many of the early Record of Lodoss War games. Micro Cabin, notable for the reimagining of Roberta Williams' Mystery House into a kind of treasure mansion puzzle series, as well as the extremely popular Zack series of RPGs. System Soft, a computer company that started out as the licensor of Brotobun's Lode Runner and went on to create many titles in the long-running Daisen Ryaku wargame series. Crystal Soft, RPG developers notable for Crimson, and Bulletproof Software, a company run by the legendary Hank Rogers that was famous for the RPG The Black Onyx, and for becoming the publishers of many versions of a little game called Tetris. With all of these lauded companies, the manual for the Eternal Story adventure game continues the same conceit, with detailed and enthusiastic written promises from members of each team that formed Session 61. From the writing, we can gather a bit more about the game's development, as pseudonyms were utilized in the credits for reasons that are honestly beyond me, something that will come up again involving Session 61 later on in the video. Thankfully, the photo and some massive help from the retro gaming community have assisted in finding some of the designers, such as contests to hire both tech employees Michio Nishizawa, the designer of the game Topple Zip, and Koichi Muniishi, one of the members of Alex Brothers, who designed contest winner and fun action puzzle game Yokai Detective Chima Chima, as well as Shuhei Yoshida from Bulletproof Software, not the one that went on to work for Sony. In the manual for Gall Force PC-98, a game also known as Prelude to Chaos in that particular manual, Micro Cabin reps mentioned that they made the graphics for the game and got them down to a 3-disc size. The people that worked on that aspect would include Masashi Kato, the game designer of the adorable Harry Fox games. System SOCOM indicates that they helped in planning, although their staff photos from the time don't give credit to anyone in the company photograph. But it's Thinking Rabbit that takes credit for most of the story adaptation, and yep, we'll see some Imabayashi experimentation here, for better and for worse. Finally, System Soft mentioned that they worked on performance for the game. So with all of that talent behind it, how is it? Well, in order to understand the limits of the game, it's best to talk about the first OVA and work the game is based on, Gall Force Eternal Story. It's worth noting that if you grew up in the 1990s in the United States, you probably saw this on the Sci-Fi Channel, as it was one of their more popular titles to rerun. Premiering as part of a festival on the channel in 1996, it aired almost immediately on the Saturday anime morning block and continued to air at least 11 more times until the end of the run in 2000. Spoilers for both the first anime and adventure game apply, and it's worth noting that due to ArtMix copyright claims on video footage, I can't show you footage from the OVA itself that isn't promotional in nature, so we'll be going with pages from the lovely Gall Force MOOC art magazine instead, which has hundreds of cells describing the action. The story of the first Gall Force OVA expands a bit on the photo novel, in which the characters were more ciphers than archetypes. It again concerns the war between the Solenoids and the Paranoids, and this time the 7 characters, 6 initially, are on the flagship Aconcagua, and have been ordered to defend a terraforming planet called Chaos. From here, a series of incidents occur in both the anime and game that begin to pick off the crew one by one. In the start of the anime, a battle in space leads to a pilot, Luffy, crashing into the bay of the Aconcagua, angering the practical and focused first officer of the ship, Rabi, now a bit more serious and having lost the bunny ears. The crew and its new comrade in arms, almost immediately afterwards have to evacuate to a starship called the Starleaf due to this and other damage. In the beginning of the game, this has happened off-screen, and Luffy is already part of your crew. This change doesn't work as well as the development team had hoped, with now Luffy as a long-standing crew member who just inexplicably has almost constant tension with Rabi, the protagonist. Amusingly, the game also actually tries to sidestep this rather complicated beginning by having Rabi sleep through the initial elements of the plot. The first task of the crew is to repair battle damage to the Starleaf, which is reproduced fairly faithfully in the command list adventure game, although a lot of the more complex sequences, including a spacewalk, are merely implied in the game. This is followed by some more character conflict between Rabi and Luffy. As Luffy is an ace pilot and has killed many paranoids, Rabi doesn't trust her, feeling that she simply got medals for murder. Luffy rips off her medal in response, a sequence duplicated in the game. Almost immediately after that, a space battle occurs, and it's the first time a player character can die. Still tied to the menu system, it's a bit of an annoying puzzle, using one of my most hated tricks in adventure games, hitting the same menu option repeatedly, and only getting a different result after many tries. It is ridiculously strict and probably came from Thinking Rabbit, as it is more or less a duplication of a puzzle in the game Jack the Las Vegas Serial Murders. and has been widely complained about as the point where many people get stuck. At least they've progressed a little bit. While you had to hit the same option 15 times in Jack, you only have to do it 10 times in 3 separate instances in Gall Force. In the anime here, Luffy is left behind as the ship escapes, but further entries in the series would resurrect her by claiming that her mech suit put her in stasis. In the game, though, she dies here. This highlights a problem that the adventure game and the Gall Force series has as a whole. It has a tendency to introduce or complicate characters and then kill them off extremely close to immediately afterwards, making it hard to feel attached or care about any of the characters. It's tough to build a franchise off of people that die too quickly for the viewer to develop any interest in them. Moving on, though, the second section of the story is heavily based on Alien, but also elaborates more on plot points and has a more natural flow in the game version than the OVA, despite another irritating design decision. Essentially, 2 plot tracks are occurring. A fired weapon into the side of the ship during the last battle has released a creature into the spaceship hulls. And while dealing with that problem, the team members are growing increasingly suspicious of Cathy, as she has been one of the quieter members of the team. While the OVA has this second plot point explained through dialogue, the game does this through a love scene between Rabi and her captain, Iluza. Iluza seduces Rabi, but reveals after being in private and turning out the lights, the real reason that she is speaking to her is that she thinks Cathy is working her own agenda, and might have even sabotaged the ship. Although, Iluza and Rabi do discuss their feelings for each other briefly. This comes a bit out of nowhere and seems like it mainly exists for the dual purpose of titillation to sell more copies, and character angst. As unfortunately, in that Gall Force fashion, Iluza is almost immediately killed in an encounter quickly after this dialogue sequence, being absorbed by the alien and giving hints of a greater conspiracy with her dying words. But even though this is rushed and sometimes feels like shock for the sake of shock, the writing does something interesting here that I didn't expect for a game from this era. The pain of losing someone so close to their confession changes Rabi's personality quite differently, and it makes her outlook into something much more grim and fatalistic, something consistently expressed through the rest of the game. It's also made clear that this is her primary motivation for a lot of her decisions from this point, which the OVA didn't really stress due to the love story element not being a factor. While it's still pretty basic, it's there, and I do consider this to be an improvement on some of the storytelling in the OVA. I think the reasoning of the developers here was that in the OVA, Rabi was very broken up over Iluza's death, and this was the writers theorizing that a relationship between the two characters might have been the reason why. While plot and pacing issues still occur, it's tough to develop characters when you keep killing them off. This aspect does have a bit of payoff much later in the game. Patty, another member of the team, is also absorbed into the monster during these events, but she does not die, and at this point, you're probably thinking where this is going if you've seen any science fiction film between 1970 and 1990. The gameplay of this section when you hunt down the monster is randomized, and has a large number of rooms in the maze you are trying to encounter the monster in. What this means in practice is this section can be over in 30 seconds, or be over much, much later, with a Sierra-style death when encountering the monster if you've forgotten to pick up a certain item. Without a save here, this is very tense, but it's more than a bit annoying. My longest time was an hour and a half. After Rabi kills the monster with the bazooka, taking the precaution to latch a wire to the side of the ship so she doesn't get sucked out into space, Pony, yet another surviving member of the team who doesn't really have any real distinguishing characteristics in the anime or game other than likes computers and is fairly reasonable as a person, stays behind on the damaged Starleaf as the others evacuate to a landing vessel for Chaos in order to figure out what is going on and resolve the Catty plot. It wouldn't be Alien without a betraying android, and it turns out that Caddy is an artificial human placed on the ship in order to ensure something called the Species Unification Project. An attempt to use a life form to merge with a solenoid so that a hybrid race creature could be born that could mate with other solenoids. It is strongly implied, although not confirmed until later, that the paranoids launching the alien creature was part of this plan. A bit disturbing, but with the war and increasingly likely double genocide, not much options are left. Due to damage the ship took while fighting the alien, Pony and Caddy sacrifice themselves in order for the other members of the team to escape. This is quite graphic in the anime version. After solving some more mild puzzles in the game, and finally landing on the planet Chaos, more conflict occurs between the characters, although it is not of any major story beat note, it's just over supplies, and Patty collapses. Despite being from a single-gendered society, Rabby quickly figures out that this has to do with species unification, and teleports out of Patty a baby that grows up almost immediately and forms an attachment to Rumi, the youngest of the group. While this is rushed in the anime, it is incredibly sped through in the game, being at max 3 screens and 5 lines of dialogue. The adventure game doesn't do as good enough a job on setting up the feelings of the characters, but it's still passable. Some more consulting of the data that Pony has retrieved puts all the cards on the table. This new life form is the goal of the Species Unification Project, although it wasn't done entirely in the way that the two armies wanted. The plan was this. Caddy would sabotage the ship so that it got to Chaos further than the fleet that was supposed to arrive there. The paranoids would fire an alien into the ship that would absorb some of the crew members, and those crew members, due to contact with this alien creature, would eventually morph into a new type of creature that could mate with solenoids. This didn't happen, and the baby happened instead. Due to its strange nature, though, it's already grown into an adult form. The surviving members of the team don't really have time to discuss this, though, as the solenoid and paranoid fleets have both arrived at Chaos. And the knowledge of a possible future for both races doesn't deter either of them from attacking, with the solenoid army leaders even contacting Rabby to bring the life form back to them. The paranoids want it as well, and this makes the ruling bodies of the solenoid fleet so desperate that they start attacking their own ships to get to the life form. Sick of everything, and in the game, still wounded from the death of her would-be lover, Rabby shoots the communication screen out, and decides she would rather die facilitating an escape for Rumi and the life form, and then 2 different versions of the final scene occur. In the film, Rabby and Patty engage in a futile aerial fight against both armies while rigging a terraformer on Chaos to explode. And in the game, they decide to stay behind on foot and rig everything to blow up while all armies bear down on them, which feels a bit more darker and dramatic. The youngest escape from the planet, and Rabby and Patty die, hoping that this will bring about a new future for everyone. This grim ending is where the game stops, but the anime OVA continues by revealing a modern-day Earth with reincarnations of the characters going about their day, and another revealed that the planet Chaos was our moon all along, and we've essentially witnessed the creation of humanity. So as you can see, the biggest problem with the adventure game is its almost fanatical devotion to the events of the story. It reminded me of the Japanese-only Back to the Future adventure game, in that anything that didn't follow the rigid canon of the work it was based on resulted in a quick and immediate death. While the graphics are very well realized in creating Sonoda's character designs, and the game is very impressive technically, it doesn't really do much to differentiate itself, and sometimes feels more like a read-along record than a game. But, to its credit, it does flesh out more character motivations, and gives Rabby especially a bit more dimension. Part of the reason for this rigidity is that the original creator of the work, novelist Hideki Kakanuma, had huge involvement with making sure that Session 61 kept very, very close to the other versions of the story, and mentioned in interviews in Gall Force books that he was very, very strict on making sure it stayed that way. So I don't think you can blame the developers here. I don't know if this was the right tactic to take. Gall Force Eternal Story, the adventure game, just honestly feels like it would have been a much better version if it had just given the player a bit more freedom. But more freedom was the message of planned other games in the series. While Session 61 was the name of the group, the companies involved also had a publishing venture called Scap Trust. And Scap Trust would produce more than just the Gall Force games, most notably Starship Rendezvous, a combination top-down shooter, an RPG, that was notable for fantastic music composed by the duo who would go on to score Final Fantasy Tactics, and a very clumsy attempt at integrating video into the game. Something I can't show you for reasons you can probably guess. Scap Trust also developed hopping vampire tile puzzle game Shikin Joe and worked as a publishing arm for other companies. But it was the Gall Force games that had the most hype and ran into the most trouble. In Eternal Story's release manual, much promotion was made by Hummingbird Soft, BPS, BothTech, and Crystal Soft of two upcoming games in the series: Under the Rainbow, an action strategy game meant to be in similar style to T&E's Diva series, and Raging Chaos, a top-down RPG. But these games did not just fail to materialize, they failed in one of the most trust-eroding ways possible, as Session 61 would occasionally take out columns in magazines saying Raging Chaos was done and within 1 month of release. This happened in 1987, and again in 1988, and again in 1989. The 1989 preview and login is particularly frustrating, as it mentions that while the game is almost complete, we swear this time. It would be changing platform to being exclusive to the Sharp X68000. This strategy did nothing to increase sales or reputation, and after a couple of months, and the failure to finish another previewed game, a Vietnam War simulator from a soldier's perspective called NAM 1968, Scap Trust would scale back after this to just porting. And eventually, despite one regression to making a possible note of a port of Raging Chaos for MSX in 1990, would go bankrupt shortly afterwards with no other titles released. While there have been rumors of mismanagement on blogs and Wikipedia entries and other similar things, it seems clear that what actually happened to Session 61 here is that with all of these delays, audiences simply decided to move away from Gall Force games. It doesn't seem to have affected the relationship between the companies, though, as many of them would go on to form the Disc Original Group, or DOG, with the purpose of porting computer games to consoles and making new exclusives for the Famicom. Garry Lab and Square would join here, with BPS, System Soft, and BothTech stepping back. But this time around, the companies that had joined the group would have some issues with Square's leadership, and even the Disc Original Group would have unreleased titles, such as this Famicom port of Alpha, the only evidence of which we have is this screenshot here. The anime series, however, would continue through to greater success, making Luffy the new protagonist, and having her go up against the Paranoid and Solenoid armies in Part 2 and Part 3. They were not as well received as the original. And while sequel series did come out set on a ravaged Earth, and there was a reboot of sorts attempted in the 2000 that lost Sonoda as a character designer, nothing quite hit internationally as well as that first OVA. One thing that did separate Gall Force from its contemporaries was the darker nature of its stories, and this fatalistic tone itself would be mocked mercilessly in two parody animations produced by Artmic and Sony. The first being a making-of promotional for the third OVA called 10 Little Gall Force, in which super deformed versions of the characters appear in comedy bits, and a Wacky Races pastiche starring characters from multiple Artmic properties called Scramble Wars. As to Japan's obsession with Wacky Races, someday we'll get to that. As for the hit-bit MSX and the MSX in general, Nishi and Gates would eventually have a bit of a falling out, with sources varying on the reasoning for this. Due to a New York Times article, it has long been believed that this fallout was due to spending on an event that was celebrating 1 million MSX units sold by hiring Godzilla creators, Tsuburaya Productions, to build a giant dinosaur in a park. However, Nishi disputes this idea, stating that the entire event was paid for by ASCII, and Microsoft's money was never touched. Instead, he mentions a personality conflict and general disagreement over how to conduct business that simply boiled over. It takes a lot to say that there's no diplomacy or business reasoning here. I just didn't like the guy at that point. The MSX, as for Nishi's predictions, would go on to do very well in Japan and Europe, although not the UK, proving a good portion of Nishi's instinct. In celebration of that, Nishi has been working currently for a number of years on 2 projects of upgraded versions of the machines called the MSX0 and MSX3, but due to long delays and no finished product, it has encountered some controversy and is beginning to look like it might be vaporware at this point. However, despite all of this, in 2024, at the 50th anniversary of Microsoft, the former friends were reunited. Let's just hope that dinosaurs weren't a topic of conversation. Gall Force's computer games exist as an interesting example of bubble-era Japan, and its rather unique excesses, especially as one of a programming supergroup, which is honestly pretty rare for that environment. But that doesn't mean that the titles didn't have a lot of artistic merit and historical interest. The STG made for the MSX and Famicom Disk System could have essentially been a simple showcase for the Sony Hitbit to sell a machine, or just a lazy port. But it's a legitimately great game, with mechanics and ideas that feel about a decade ahead of when the games came out. That HAL Laboratory magic. And while the adventure game would be nowhere near as successful as expectations set it out to be, with not a single port of it appearing in top 30 sales lists during its year of release, and the computer system that made it that started this whole chain of events would have its own drama, changed ideas, misunderstanding, and conflict, they still stand as testaments to ingenuity on trying something different, taking things that are familiar and attempting to branch them out in new ways to try to move technology and the medium forward. And while not everyone that came out of these projects became as famous as Satoru Iwata, it just goes to show where all their hearts and minds were at that point and what their main goal was. Drawing a whole bunch of different people with different skills together to create something new. See you next time. And that's it for covering Gall Force and the MSX. As always, when you're researching these types of topics, there may be people that use primary sources, but end up going in a different direction than you did. And I'd like to take a couple of seconds to highlight those people before I go into the Patreon stuff. The writer Sean O'Mara at the website zimmerit.moe goes into a great deal more about Artmic, and that website and those articles even have translations of some of the books that were used as primary sources for this article. Additionally, the website Gears Online has a very well-curated small wiki on Gall Force that also goes into a bit greater detail on Starfront and the other sequel OVAs, which we simply didn't have time to cover in this video. Finally, there's programmer and MSX tutor Javier Lavandiera, who was one of the people who discovered which MSX magazine actually had more information about MSX Dinosaur Land. The usual special thanks to members of Gaming Alexandria for their assistance in procuring materials for this video. particularly Ethan Johnson for his efforts in getting some of the information on Spectra Video, and Ragebeat for helping me gather some of the documents that I could not obtain through scan or auction. And, of course, special thanks to the users on the Patreon, including Matt Leffler, Andro, James B., Peter Tushar, Randall Eaglebauer, Yorsk, Joseph Holly, King Gidra, Mooware, and the King of Homestyle. As always, subscribing to certain tiers on the Patreon will allow you access to certain bonuses. And this time around, it'll be a deeper look at both SpectraVision and the Disc Original Group. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.